So I do have just like my old one that I did when I was a student. So I tried to make his motivation clear. See, I've added some kind of texture to him. He's like a random bag of coffee. And I don't know, for some reason I decided to make him like really limpy. And he just sort of like falls over, and the way he gets back up is appalling. There's like no weight to it, so like do better. Do better than that. And then he just like casually falls off a counter. So that was my SAC assignment. I also just like, for grins, we had a slightly different assignment, which was like the claw, which might be a thing in animation too, I don't know. But I sort of decided to, what are you doing? The loading. And then I just also sort of like, again with the reusing of random assets, and then the little SAC guy like cameos in that. So just like two kind of silly examples of SAC animations. What is this? Why? I like how Vimeo just decides to play weird stuff for no apparent reason. So anywho, SAC animation sort of examples. And I'm not like, for the SAC, I don't care if he has like a really like obvious obstacle. I'm mostly just looking for, does he move in some kind of interesting and like realistic way? And does he have, you know, motivation for like whatever he's doing? So anywho, I promised you guys some rigging, so we're gonna do some of that. Just for grins, I'll like demo this dude a little later, but this is just like a human rig that I made for some dude. And there's like some kind of, I guess, more advanced stuff that's incorporated in this rig that I'm not gonna go over, and that's more of like an Animation 2 thing. But I did mention, so I'll just use this guy really quick to like sort of explain a different concept for how legs move. So you'll notice that if I move his hip controller around, that the same as the flower stack rig, his hips pretty much stay planted in place, unless I move it really far away, in which case it just sort of starts pulling him randomly. But this is not unexpected. This is like how the rig is designed to work. So if I wanted him to walk through space, here this dumb plane, I would have to move his feet over so that like the leg controllers are actually walking at the same time as the rest of him. It looks like he is skipping merrily through flowers now, with a sword in his neck. But anywho, so that's like the sort of weird, so like that's one functionality of rigging, and that's called IK. And there's two types basically, like IK and FK. So IK you're gonna use, and I'll show you how to set this up later, but basically, again, it's if you move one controller, the IK is gonna sort of plant itself in place, which is great for stuff where you need body parts to be stationary. Like if you have your arms planted on a table and you're like moving your torso around, IK is great for that. Really great for walk cycles because you don't need to like counter key against the body movements. So there is another type of way to move your character, and that's basically like you have to select each controller and just move them individually, pretty much. So notice right now for the IK, if I grab the foot control, I can move this up and around, and it's basically moving two joints at once. It's moving his hip, I guess, like the upper part of his leg and the lower part of his leg at the same time just by using this one controller. So this is IK. If you want FK, I'm just gonna pop that back over. So this leg is now working on IK, and then this one that is straight is working on FK. So you'll notice that if I move the hip, the FK leg is going to stay in place and actually move with the hip. And you'll see maybe that's like kind of following these controllers. So if I want to move this leg, I have to grab the individual controllers themselves, and let's break this guy's leg, and move those individually. So again, this is like individual joint control. This is really good for, I usually use it for arms, honestly. So it's nice for getting perfect arcs for stuff. If you, like, God, where is this arm controller? Here we go. So if you're like trying to make this guy, have his arms swing as he walks or something like that, trying to do it with IK is really annoying because you'll notice that just sort of like translating it back and forth looks pretty terrible. So to get a nice sort of swing where the arm isn't like bending weirdly and just like staying in a perfectly straight line, you'd have to basically like key it back here, move it down, key it, like this, and then just do this like repeatedly for everything. Whereas, like, let me just swap this other arm to FK. So setting up this IK-FK switch where it can toggle back and forth between IK and FK functionality, I have some notes and some videos on it. I'm not really going to go over it in this class because, again, that's like kind of more advanced and annoying. It just happens to be convenient for like demoing stuff. So in this case, like if I want his arm to be swinging back and forth, I can pretty much just like grab the lower part and then just swing it, you know, as needed with the giant sword. And you can see that's already making like a nice even arc. So I can just kind of go, and this is like way more naturalistic looking with way more minimum, or like way less effort than trying to make this IK do the same thing. So again, just like depending on what you need, you can set these up differently. Like the head I never really need to be fixed anywhere in like particular spots, so I just set that up on FK. If I want to move it, I just grab the individual controllers. So again, this leg is IK. If I move the hip, it's going to stay where it is. This one's FK. You just kind of got to counter key against the motion that you're doing. Other things to be aware of, just like with IK, you can get what's called IK popping, which is another thing to definitely watch out for and sort of try to avoid. Let me zero this out because this is incredibly confusing to look at. And you see this is like a whole lot of weird custom attributes I put on here. So like it's gone through and I have like some heel roll stuff. I can make him stand on his tippy toes, bend it like the ball of his foot. And this is like all just one, done with like grouping and keying some controllers and stuff like that. Again, sort of like demonstration of where the things that were in last week's video recordings would be, you know, helpful for rigging. But anyway, so IK popping is basically and it happens like a lot in arms, I find, more so than legs, but you'll sort of notice like if I pull this to a certain extent, the leg snaps perfectly straight, and it has like a really awkward look if you're animating it. What have I done? Oh yes, good. Arm controller's like really, really high. But it's just like, again, kind of a, if I notice it in anyone's animation, if you're using rigs, I will definitely point it out. Because you can see, like, again, with this arm, so like if I move the torso up a little bit, and the arm is getting stretched just enough so it kind of looks like he's hyperextending his arm a little bit. The simple solution is either to move the torso down slightly, or just move the arm up slightly so that you don't get that like weird popping. Because like I can actually hyperextend my arm like that, and it's gross, but like normal people can't do that, and it usually looks really weird in animation because it happens for like 1 or 2 frames. My God, what have I done to this dude? Anywho, anyone have any questions between the difference between IK and FK? All right, I'll show you how to set up both today. I'm going to do that in not this file. So the first thing that you need if you want to set up joint chains is some kind of model to put them on. And I'm just going to make, for now, a really sad little cylinder that's just sort of like long and bendy. So the same thing, and this goes for using deformers as well, but if you want to bend something, you need the geometry there to actually support that bending movement. So in this case, like if I, just for the sake of argument, I'll grab both of these guys and put a bend deformer on it. Hopefully it's facing in, okay. Herg. These are like literally never facing the correct direction that I want. But you'll notice that again, if you want that nice smooth bend, you do actually need the geometry there compared to this one, which looks kind of like a sad noodle. They actually both look like different types of noodles, but anyway. But yeah, so if you're gonna rig something or like use a deformer, please do make sure that you have enough geometry there to support whatever kind of bending motion that you're doing. So basically, I'm just gonna pretend that this is a sort of sad arm. I'll make a sad extrusion for an elbow, and this is now our glorious, glorious arm. So rigging. If you want to start rigging, usually you will go into the rigging menu at the top instead of the modeling menu. And the first thing you're going to want to do is create a few joints. And joints are basically, oh yeah, good point. It happened the other day. All right, cool. Holy crap, that's like a solid ½ inch below the top of my screen. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. All right, where's this thing? So joints are basically like fake digital bones that hold a certain length, and that's what helps to make things move in a realistic way, so you know your arms aren't like stretching out into super weird heights. So if I go into my, again, rigging menu, skeleton, there's pretty much the first option for create joints. I almost never click into the settings of this, and you'll notice that I can now just click pretty much anywhere on my screen, and it's just going to start putting joints there. So, like I said, the only time I ever go in to the settings for that, and for once it actually sets it up pretty nicely. Sometimes, and I will break this intentionally, if you look at the radius for the bones, sometimes they're set to be like super tiny, like 0.1 or something insane. So if I make that, you can see that just like, it's purely a visual thing, but like these joints are way smaller. So if you ever need to click on them, it can be a little bit harder. It can just be harder to like visualize where stuff is. So you can actually, if you want to, come down and manually set that value in the channel box. If you need to do that for more than one joint, I recommend just going in and changing the settings in the actual menu. So like originally this was 2, and I feel like that's reasonable, so I'm gonna just kind of leave it like that. And again, purely visual, has no functional impact on anything. It does just make things way easier to see. So now that I've covered the floor of my scene in joints like a crazy person, I just want to talk a little bit about how they actually sort of function. So you'll notice that as I set these up, this is the first collection of joints that I made. It pretty much just labels them chronologically like it does with cubes and any other thing. You'll notice that it has laid them out in a hierarchy. So the first joint I created is going to be the top of the hierarchy. If I say rotate that around, it's going to take the rest of everything with it. If I grab the 5th joint in that hierarchy, that's the 5th joint that I created, and I can again rotate that around, and it's going to take anything underneath it, basically. So this is like, again, one way you can sort of set up, you know, spines, legs, just things you want to be generically bendy. And you can, if you need to, and you want like, oh, I want joint 5 to be its own separate joint chain, you can just grab it and middle mouse button drag it out of that original hierarchy. And you can see that it's now set up so all of the other joints are still under it, grouped under it, and will behave the same way they did before. It's just now not connected to joint 4. So if I grab joint 4, I can still rotate this around. It might be a little bit hard to see. Can rotate that around, it's just not going to take joint 5. If I decide like, oops, that's not what I wanted to do, grab joint 5, throw it under joint 4, it's going to reattach those little bones. And you'll notice that the sort of direction, the bones are sort of like oriented like arrows almost. So the way, like the skinnier end is going to be the child, and the thicker end is going to be the parent that's going to sort of drive the rest of the chain, if that makes sense. That's more or less how joints are set up, and how they sort of appear in the outliner. Other things to be aware of with joints, so they are, because they're set up as being parented to each other, and that's just like how they function, they will always have translation values on the joints. So if I just go through, and I'm just going to select all of these joints, and for the sake of demonstration, zero out all of their translation values, you'll notice that it's just a giant unholy pile of joints that's smashed into the origin now. So again, these will pretty much always have translation values. You can't really zero them out. It's just part of the way joints work. They'll always have these values. What your joints should never have is scale values or rotation values. So a lot of times, if you're just like using a quick rig, not even a rig, but like you just throw in some joints to pose a model, and you're not animating them or rigging them or doing anything fancy with them, rotation values aren't going to kill you. If you're rigging it, never have rotation values or scale values on any of your joints, because it will probably explode something and be a horrible mess to fix later. So I'm just going to go through and Ah, yes. Interesting. All right. So you'll notice that like joint 4 has a rotation value, and if I zero that out, it actually pops up the rest of the joints. And if you remember, I did unparent joint 5, and then I was like playing with the rotation of joint 4. So in this case, the fix for this, if I want these joints to all be laying flat where they are, is to unparent joint 5 again, get rid of the rotation on joint 4, and then grab joint 5 and put it back under joint 4. So it's a little bit convoluted, but that's just like what you need to do if you want the positioning to be maintained. So again, don't have rotation values on your joints if you're going to use them for rigging. I'm probably going to say that like 30 more times. And for some reason, every once in a while, Maya will set a value of -0 as a rotation, and that can also still break your rig, and I don't know why it does it, but sometimes it does. But that does, again, count as rotation. But you can see that basically, if I rotate one of these, it does keep the length between them, and that's just, again, because these are all parented to each other and operating under local space. So it's, in a strange way, almost no different than having a bunch of random circles that are sort of parented to each other. So if I grab this one, it's still keeping this same distance between these spheres. It's just spheres instead of joints, and they're not like quote-unquote physically connected together by these little lines. Any questions on any of that so far? All right. So actually setting up some like functional joint chains. Let's get rid of all of these. And this weird floating joint. All right. So I'm just going to say, let's just sort of start rigging this silly little arm, and I want it to bend at the approximate elbow here. So to set something like that up, again, just go to your skeleton menu and do create joints. And if the top of it is the shoulder, so like if you're moving your arm, if you think about it, your shoulder drives the rest of the arm. So it makes sense to start at the top, because if you move your shoulder, you want your elbow to follow it instead of moving your elbow and having your shoulder follow it. So I'm going to start at the top, and I'll start a little bit far forward. So for arms and legs, it's usually good to have a slight bend in the direction that you want the joint. So in this case, like I'm going to start, again, slightly forward at the shoulder, go slightly off-center towards the back of the elbow, and then I'll come slightly forward again for the wrist. So you can see, let me just hide that. So you can see that this is sort of my arm shape. So again, shoulder, got a little elbow here. And there's a few reasons to do this. It does serve a functional purpose when using IK. It also just sort of visually is nice to see like that little bend in the elbow. It just sort of helps to make things like a little bit more natural in a strange sort of way. So I'll go back into the side view and unhide my cylinder. I'm just gonna go through really quick and name these like shoulder, elbow, and not pay attention to how I just spelled elbow. So just like weird note, if you guys ever find it, I find it horrible to look at joints in wireframe mode. It's just gross to me. So if you go into the little menus right above your viewport, like where you attach image planes, go into the shading tab and you can do X-ray joints. And what that'll do is it'll basically show your joints through your model. So I'll do it on the perspective as well. And you can see that now, no matter what I do, the joints are always visible through your model. And I just find this a little bit easier to look at and work with than, again, using the wireframe. So this is like pretty much our SAD joint chain we have set up right now. And again, there's two different ways to set this up. So I will just duplicate this, shift that over. So we have IK, and I'll set this one up as FK. So setting up FK is actually fairly straightforward. Normally, when you are working with joints and rigs, rigs especially, you are going to want to add what's called controllers. And if you remember like the flour sack rig or the other rig I just showed you, it's like a crap ton of a lot of NURBS curves that are just sort of everywhere. You can use geometry, it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm just going to go and use NURBS curves as well. I like NURBS curves. So these are just going to be my controllers. So I just made, again, simple little circles, and then I just used V to vert snap them into the exact positioning of these joints. The next thing that you're going to want to do for this, and this is, I always forget to do this, and then I have to like break a bunch of my stuff and like redo things. Before you start attaching your joints to these controllers, go through and zero out their translation, usually rotation, and scale values. Because that way, like if you want your character to go back to T-pose or like to have a straight arm, you can just zero out, again, all of the like rotation values for that, instead of having to like manually figure out where his arm is set up each time. So again, grab your controllers, and I'm just going to go through and zero out all of these values for them. Yep?
Question, I didn't know because there's like a good practice list. Should you like orient your controllers to be at the same angle as your
Completely aesthetic. Functionally, it makes absolutely no difference at all. There is a sort of way you can do things with like some parenting and some like extra grouping to set up like clavicle controllers so that the controller will actually, because like the clavicle isn't usually like a straight up and down, it's kind of like a side to side motion. So you can set up a controller like that and have it drive that, but like the way the controller looks doesn't really matter, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so once we've zeroed out the controllers, we're going to go through and use constraints to attach the joints to the controller. Probably going to do this in the wrong order, but I'm going to grab my joint, and I'm going to connect my shoulder joint to the shoulder control. And I'll just go constrain, and I'll just do parent. Usually you can just do orient constraint, but I just sort of like the ability, I did, every single time. All right, grab your controller and then your joint chain. There we go. I don't know. I always forget how to set up constraints, and then I have to undo it and redo it in the right order. So grab your controller and then your joint. But you'll notice that once I've done that, I can grab the controller and use that to control the joint. So whatever rotation values are on my controller are going to be transferred to the joint. And because I've zeroed it out, I can basically just go in and set all the rotation values to 0 and have the arm pointing straight back down again. And unfortunately, once you constrain your controllers, if you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to zero them out, you have to delete all of your constraints, freeze the transformations on your controller, and then reset up all of your constraints, which for something like an arm with like 3 finger joints for 5 fingers is like really annoying. So I'm just going to pretty much go back and do that for the rest of this. So again, controller, and then joint, and then just apply that parent constraint. So now if I, rotate the elbow, it's rotating the wrist, or it's rotating the elbow, but not in the way that I expect. Anyone have a guess about why this is not working like a normal arm elbow would be? Yeah? Yes. So this is the thing that I also always forget to do. But the way the joints are set up, once you attach controllers to them, it's completely like, their positioning and rotation is completely dependent on those controllers. So I do need these controllers to actually be set up and parented to each other. So I'm going to grab the wrist, throw that under the elbow, and throw it under the shoulder. And I'm just hitting P, so I'm just going to select the elbow and then shift select the shoulder, and then I'm just pressing P on the keyboard, and it's the hotkey for parenting. So now, theoretically, if I move my elbow, it should behave like an actual elbow. And then same thing with the shoulder, it'll take the elbow with it, etc. So again, the joints are completely dependent upon the controllers. So I could, if I wanted to, go in and like unparent all of these joints from each other and just animate with disconnected joints. And it would be really annoying to do this, so I don't recommend it, but like you could. So that's, just undo that so these are connected. So that's more or less setting up a little FK controlled arm. And this works for however many joints you have in whatever orientation position you have. FK rigs are fairly simple, if not a little bit monotonous to set up. Questions on that so far? All right. So other thing is, this was FK, we're going to go over IK. And this is almost easier, sort of, to set up, kind of. So again, go to your skeleton menu, and if you go down, you want to look for Create IK Handle. And this one I usually do double check the settings. It's pretty much always set to Rotation Plane Solver, but you do want Rotation Plane Solver as opposed to Single Chain Solver. So if it's a new computer, I just double check and like just make sure that it's actually set that way. But pretty much the same thing as before. So select whatever you want to be like the top or base of the movement. So like in this case, I want the shoulder to not move off the chest randomly. I want to be able to like drag the wrist around and have it sort of bend the arm at the shoulder. So grab that point that should be connected to the body, and then shift select the last joint in the chain, in this case the wrist, and you'll notice that it'll turn the skeleton orange. And if I just hide this skin, you'll notice it's added this like weird little line between them, as well as this sort of like, usually these are displayed much larger on my computer, but it adds this like little extra sort of thing or handle in the joint. And if I grab that thing or handle, as I just called it, and move it up and down, you can see that it's moving both joints at once, pretty much the same behavior as like the legs and arms from the functional rigs I just showed you. So that's honestly like pretty much all there is to setting up IK. There's some other stuff you can do to kind of refine the motion of that. I'll go through that a little bit later. The other thing that I wanted to point out, so I mentioned, I think in the recording about setting up custom attributes, there's like this twist for the IK handles, and that is found if you select the IK handle itself and you go into the channel box, you can find that twist value there. And that's just good. Again, it'll sort of like rotate around. Basically the equivalent of like if you have your elbow, or you're standing over a table with your hand planted on it, you can like rotate your elbow and have your hand stay in place. Pretty much all that does. Also, sometimes if you like turn your rig and it's IK, your knees and arms or whatever is being operated are just going to start going in weird directions, and you'll just need to key the twist to get them back into place. It's a strange feature of Maya. But that's more or less setting up IK. And then if you want to actually control that, so it's also usually bad to animate on your IK handles directly. So you would want another controller for that. So I'm just going to make another sad NURB circle, use V, and just vert snap that down onto the joint. And this time, instead of parenting it or constraining the joint to the controller, I'm going to constrain the IK handle to the controller. So again, I'm just going to grab that, and for IK handles, you pretty much always want to use a parent constraint, since you're controlling both orientation and actually rotation fails half the time, but whatever. I usually use parent constraints for those. And you can see that if I grab the controller, it is now moving the arm around. And actually, so you can get away with just a point constraint for these, because the orient doesn't really do anything to the IK handle itself. It's just kind of force of habit for me to use parent constraints. So again, that's the difference between FK and IK and just like setting up little joints. Any questions about that so far?
You added a controller to only the last joint. Could you also add controllers to the other ones as well? Like for the IK handle?
Okay.
Or for you?
Yeah, to be honest, I've actually... you can, yes. I've never tried it. I'm like, I've totally tried that. So yeah, so grab the controller, put it in the shoulder, and then grab the joint itself. And then I'm just going to do an orient constraint for that. So now, theoretically, if I... Wait, is it not? Oh wait, no. Yeah, you actually can't do that. Yeah, I'm actually... Wait. It's been so long since I've tried to do that, I like legitimately forgot. Okay, yeah, so you can do orient constraints still pretty much don't really do anything. But you can, drag it around from the top. So this would be something, usually if I have something like this set up, I end up having another controller, sort of like a hip or a clavicle that ends up sort of driving that rotation. But yeah, so if you do need to set something like that up, you can do that. Any other questions? Cool. So that is most of that. So I did promise you a sad arm, and what is a sad arm without a sad bendy cylinder attached to it? So I'm going to show you how to, because like joints are all fine and dandy, but like joints don't render and neither do these NURBS controllers. So you want a skin to actually move with your rig. So the easiest way to attach a skin is to just grab the skin and your skeleton, doesn't really matter which order you do, and go up to the skin menu and do bind skin. So I'm just going to see what the default does and we will go from there. So I'm just going to grab my controller. It's actually not completely horrendous. If your topology is set up decently, Maya will usually do a fairly good job of having bends look reasonable. If your topology is like really sketchy, sometimes like really weird stuff happens. But there's ways to fix that later. So you can see that again, pretty much we now have like a weird moving little arm skin. So there's a few sort of, again, different settings that you can use if you want to attach skins to things. So I'll actually go into the settings of the bind skin option, and there's like 3 things that I usually pay attention to in here, and that is the bind to option and the max influences. All of this stuff is kind of just different math equations Maya uses to calculate weights. So if you find that like one does a really horrible job, you can sort of play around and sort of like click through different options and see if some of the other ones get you a little better default binding. But for the most part, I like honestly very rarely play with these. So again, first thing I usually look at is bind to. By default, it's set to joint hierarchy. So if I can basically, what that's saying is I can select any skin and any joint in this hierarchy, and it's going to attach the skin to any joint that is connected to the one that I've selected. So before I selected the shoulder, in this case I'll select the wrist and do apply, and you can see that the rig still behaves pretty much exactly the same way as it did before. If I select, I almost never use object hierarchy. I don't think I've ever used that. But the other one I'll use sometimes is selected joints. And basically instead of, that one kind of does what it says, where like it's only going to attach that skin to the joints that you have selected when you hit this option. So I'm going to hit apply, and you can see that now if I move this, it looks nothing like an arm, but pretty much the skin is just following this little wrist joint only. So same thing, I can do that if I wanted to with the elbow joint, and that would just follow the elbow. So that, usually this is going to be really good if you want to set up something like a robot or something with like individual parts that don't need to be squishy and bendy between the joints. Or I will also use it a lot for eyeballs, because like you don't need the eyeball to move if the jaw moves, you only want it to move when the eye joint is moving. But for this example, I'm just going to go with joint hierarchy. So I'm just going to grab, again, my skin and just reattach that. The only other thing that I usually pay attention to is the max influences. And basically what weighting does, or what skin weights are, is for every single vertice on your mesh, it's a percentage value of, all right, this is like 50% going to follow the motion of the shoulder and 50% going to follow the elbow. Or it might be like 20 on the shoulder, 50 on the elbow, and then like some other portion on the wrist, if that makes sense. So each joint is again controlled by, or each vertex on your mesh is controlled by a certain number of joints. And that number of joints is this max influences here. So with 5, it's saying that for any vertice on my mesh, there could be up to 5 joints that are controlling the position of that vertice. Usually, I just sort of set this to 3, because I find it slightly easier to work with, but functionally, it doesn't really matter that much. I had that other human rig I showed you, it like has to be set to 4, because I made it for a guy who made his own game engine, and there's some like weird specific requirements for it. But yeah, so again, just kind of set it to whatever you need. I find 3 to be easy. I've never had to go more than 5 for anything. So I went ahead and applied that. And like I said before, so like by default, this actually doesn't do totally horrible things. But assuming like maybe I think this curve is like a little bit strange and I want to modify the way that looks, there are ways to do that. What have I done? Ah, yes. And this is what happens when you don't zero out your controllers. Cough. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and set, say, a keyframe on this controller. And I usually, like, when I'm messing with the skin weights, I'll just sort of set keyframes so I don't need to physically move the controller. I can just scrub back and forth in my timeline and see how my skin deformations are looking. Kind of like save some extra steps. So usually what I will also do is just hide the IK handle, like that doesn't really need to be visible. And then I'm going to grab my skeleton, and you can either hide that, or I'm going to make a display layer for it in this case. So I'm just going to hit this little white sort of square with a circle in it. It's going to make a display layer with the objects I have selected, and I'll just set that to reference. So I can see them, I just can't select them. Because joints do a weird thing where if you marquee select over everything, it will, if there's a joint anywhere in that selection, it'll only select the joints, which drives me nuts on a weirdly personal level. All right, so like I said, a few different ways to handle the skin weights of this object. The first, and I feel like maybe most straightforward, is right-click on your model, and you'll notice that as soon as it's bound to a joint, you'll get this Paint Skin Weights tool option. If you click on that, it'll pull up this gorgeous, horrible menu here. And what this is showing is basically all of the joints that influence this mesh. And if you click through them, you can kind of see, so like my wrist is, in this case, wider areas have more influence with the wrist, so like they're going to follow the wrist more closely. Areas with wulbo, as I've called it, are going to follow the elbow more closely, etc. So it's a good visual way to see what your weights are set up like, and you can also modify them in here. I usually switch this to use color ramp, and again, this is like purely visual. I just find it really hard to tell with the grayscale like how much weight is applied to things. So I'm going to check on color ramp, and you can see maybe, at least for me, I think it's a little bit more obvious what's happening. So like red is a lot of weight going down to blue, and black is no weight, blue is like very little weight. And if you ever see white anywhere, that's like only going to follow the shoulder, that kind of thing. So I just like turning that on because I think it's easier to see. And then you can go in and basically play with all of these little brushes to adjust the weights. So paint operation is going to be, honestly, it's kind of similar to Photoshop. So like replace is going to be just like coloring over the original value and replacing it entirely. Smooth is very rare. I don't think I've ever used add or scale, to be honest, but like smooth is just going to go through, and if you have like one area that's like kind of a hard, weird transition, you can hit it with the smooth brush and it'll help sort of round out the deformations. But you can play with these to get what you need. So in this case, I'm going to maybe play with the replace brush a little bit. You can choose your brush profile if you want. So there's ones with like softer edges, ones with harder edges. Again, never super found a use for this, but you can grab image files and import them as brush sizes, or as brush profiles. Usually I just stick with these two because I just think it's easy. So I'm just going to go in with, say, a solid brush. And again, opacity is pretty much the same thing as opacity in Photoshop or any other drawing program. And then value is more or less like the color you're painting on. In this case, it's not so much a color, it's a weight percentage ranging between 0 for no influence and 1 for full influence. So if I go in with this really hard brush at 1% opacity and a value of 1, so all the influence, and I paint over the vertices here, you can see that they turn white, so basically that's saying they have full influence, are going to follow the shoulder entirely. And I can go down, and you'll notice, so like if I do some of like the blue areas at the bottom, that makes like a really dramatic effect with like, clearly it shouldn't be following the shoulder, but it is. So that's where I might grab the smooth brush and come in, and if I just sort of, wow, that's aggressive. Just sort of like draw back over those, that'll help to push them back into place where they should be. And every once in a while, if you get like really, really extreme spiky sort of breaks in your mesh like this, it can be a little bit hard to actually hit them with the brush, which is like the bane of my existence. So what you can do is right-click on your mesh, grab the vertices that are sticking out, and then again, just right-click and go Paint Skin Weights tool. And there's this little hammer button here. It's basically just like select your vertices and, what are you doing? I can't see my error message. Actually, wait, hang on. All right, must access log. All right. In this case, it's yelling at me. That's what I did. What? Okay. Never had this not work for me before. Excuse me. All right. Well, normally what will happen if you select that is it will sort of grab this and like pop it back into maybe not the perfect place, but like a better place than it was before. Honestly, not entirely sure why that's not working. So I'm just going to go, actually, all right. So you could try to use the hammer tool for that. If that's not working or it's like kind of too annoying, what you can do, and I'll go over this more later because I do use it a lot for like specific like joints like elbows and things like that. Select the vertices in question, go up to Windows, General Editors, and Component Editor. And I always mess up Component Editor, which is this, and the Connection Editor, which is what we used for hooking up attributes last week. If you go into the Smooth Skins tab, you can see that it's actually listing all of the vertices you have selected, as well as the specific numerical values for their weights. So in this case, I'm like, all right, for some reason I've attached all of these to my shoulder, which I don't want at all. So you just mouse over these values, or like sort of click on all these values. You can just enter a weight of 0 manually for that, and it will just snap all of those back to 0. So a lot of times I'll use this, like if you ever rigging something and you notice like you move the right leg and it drags half the left leg with it, I'll just sort of go through and grab like all of the vertices below the elbow, right? Like I don't want these following the shoulder at all because that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll just mass select all of those and then mass select all of the weights for that shoulder joint and just zero them out so that, go back into the Paint Weights tool for a visual. You can see that now instead of being very light blue, or like a dark blue I guess it was, they're actually black. So there's no weight, the shoulder is having no effect at all on these vertices. So if you're looking for specific numerical values for things, a lot of times I will just use the component editor. It's just sort of easy to make mass modifications to things, and you don't need to like guess about what the numbers are. Any questions on that so far? Yeah. So if you change the weights of like one of these, it will affect the weights on the other joints as well. The only time where I've had it be like really, really bad about like aggressively overriding stuff is if I have, I think when you go bind skin, if you're in your bind skin option and you have this maintain max influences on, I think I actually a lot of times will check this off. Many times it will try to like sort of forcibly add more weights just so it has at least 3 things influencing it, if that makes sense. So you can turn that off and sometimes that will help. The other thing that sometimes helps is, not helps per se, but just going into your the component editor, component editor, which I just showed you, and you can just zero out all of those like dumb extra weights. And sometimes you might need to do it repeatedly and it will like add them back in, but at least it's like a really clear visual of like what's being added back in, if that helps.
One thing that helped was I locked the different ones on the previous screen.
Yeah.
But then sometimes there would be the error saying I had to unlock it to in order to
Yeah, or it'll just, in my case, it just completely ignores the locking and is just like, we're just gonna change your values anyway. And I'm like, I hate you. But yeah. No, that is a good point though. You can, if you are happy with like the weights of the shoulder, you can hit this little lock button and that should make them not be editable. It works most times. For me, sometimes I have an error where it'll change them anyway. But that does exist. Yeah. Any other questions so far? All right. So yeah, so let's try to get like a little bit better of a bend on the inner shoulder. So I usually for like elbow joints, I'd kind of just rather have it clipping and look better as it's bending than have it look like this, where it's like really sort of blobby, because I just find that really awkward. So what I'm gonna do is just go in with my replace brush, and I'm gonna maybe choose a softer brush, and I'm just gonna sort of, replace brush, and I'll just sort of paint in a little bit more weight around that shoulder, or around like the inside of that elbow, and sort of try to like push that back into something that I find to be a little bit more reasonable place. And then I can also go in, so like the top looks maybe pretty okay. I'll go in and grab the wool bow and trippy looking joints. Also, again, go in with my replace brush with a value of 1 and just sort of paint in some more weights on that and see if I can get anything that looks halfway decent. So you can see maybe like the difference between what it was. Don't you dare freeze on me. All right, well, Maya's gone nuts. Hey, it froze, hooray. Awesome. Well, I was going to say maybe you can see the difference between what it was before and what it was now, but I guess we'll figure that out once I open Maya back up again. Oh, one silly thing that I did notice the other day, which I feel like I should have noticed before, but when I was working on a thing and I had it crash a bunch, and I would go back to this temp file to try to open it. Oh, thank God. And it works this time, but every once in a while it would do like a fatal error as soon as I tried to open this and crash Maya again. I found that doesn't, and again, I don't know why this never occurred to me, I found that doesn't necessarily mean your Maya file is corrupted, it's just like this temporary save file is corrupted, so sometimes if you open the actual Maya file itself, you'll then not have to go back like 3 versions to find unbroken things. Anywho, in this case, it actually worked. Hooray. So basically now you can see, again, it's just like a little bit different in the way that the elbow bends. So it is clipping like pretty darn aggressively through that elbow area. If I go into my wireframe mode, you can see how badly it's clipping. But I think aesthetically, I feel like this sort of hard crease maybe looks a little bit nicer than what it was before, especially for like partial arm bends like this. So how you choose to handle that is largely up to you. That's usually just sort of, I prefer like that hard crease. I just think it looks nicer. So there are other ways to accomplish more or less that same thing. So if you ever need to unattach your skin, I'm just going to go back to my rigging menu, select the skin, go to skin, and do unbind. That's going to detach it from your model so that if I, scrub through the animation, no longer attached. So I'm just going to reset this up with the default weights that Maya had, so we can start fresh. Skin, bind skin. Just double checking that it's set to joint hierarchy, and I'll just set this to 3. We only have 3 joints, so it doesn't really matter here, but. All right, so now if we look at this again, we have that same kind of like wonky bend before. And say, again, I want to make this a little bit stiffer, or a little bit like less blobby right in the crease of that shoulder. So what you can do is go into your component editor again. So Windows, General Editors, Component Editor, and just go into your Smooth Skin menu. And this is again where I just sort of start making usually like mass changes to like arms, legs, fingers are all really, really good for this kind of thing. So I'm just going to grab all the vertices at the top and say these shouldn't follow the elbow at all. So they should actually just really only have influence from the shoulder. So in this case, I'm just going to grab the shoulder and set those values to 1. And I'll do the same thing for the bottom. except those should only be, I'm just gonna get rid of the influence on the wrist, what the heck. All right, so I'm just gonna set these to only follow the elbow for now. So again, I'm just gonna set those values to 1. And you can see that that's not made a huge change in the way that this crease is being handled. But what I can do, if I go in and start sort of selecting these individual vertex loops, and in case you didn't know, you can actually select loops of vertices like you can edges, pretty much the same way. So just like click on one, shift, and then double click on the one next to it, it'll select the whole loop of verts. So what I'm gonna do is say, all right, it makes no sense for any of these to have influence on the wrist. That's just, oops. And this is what happens when you set the value to 1 instead of 0. Cough. Sometimes when you do that, so I just like did Control Z to undo that, and sometimes it like won't reset the view, so you just have to reselect your vertices there. So say wrist, 0. I want the shoulder influence to be, say, like 0.95. And then the further I go down, I can just sort of keep selecting these and say, this feels like maybe it should have a little bit more shoulder influence. Again, wrist, no. I'll set the shoulder to maybe like 0.8. And it kind of is starting to like work on that bend a little bit. This middle joint, I usually just sort of keep as 50-50. It just intuitively seems like it makes sense. And the other reason that I just sort of like doing this is because you have really obvious values of like all of these. It's exactly half the weight on the elbow and exactly half the weight on the shoulder. And there's no like values of like 0.489 or anything like that, where functionally it doesn't really affect that much. It just sort of like makes my weird brain happy. And then if I need to, I can go back in with a paint weights tool and sort of like smooth or refine things as needed. So again, I'm just gonna do the same thing, except this time, this is the stuff that should be following the elbow. So I'm gonna grab and do the elbow and set that to 0.8 instead of the shoulder. And do this one as nothing on the wrist. And what did I just say? I think I did like 0.95 before for the, ooh, God. 0.95, not 0.5. And then we have some fairly quick, decent deformations, again, for that arm. For something like an arm, you can usually get away with using the paint weights tool. I find that this sort of vertice selection method is easier for stuff like fingers, where you have, 5 of these, ooh, hello, like right next to each other, and it's a little bit hard to get in sometime with a little brush and like paint in the weights. And it just sets up like really, really nice, easy fingers. Because this, by the time you like paint all these values in by hand, it's, again, just kind of easier to make bulk changes like this, I think. So that's 2 different ways you can sort of accomplish more or less the same thing. And then if I decided that I did want a little bit of weight added back, like I got rid of all of the weights on the wrist joint, you can see there's no weights there at all. I would maybe just go back in with my replace brush on that wrist and just like start tacking on some weights. And then once I have that like really sort of the weights started, I could, if I wanted to, go back with my smooth brush and then just sort of turn the, oh God, questionable. I could turn my smooth brush back on and just sort of systematically smooth up the arm a little bit, and then it would just give me like nice smooth bends if I needed that for the wrist. That's more or less how to do skin weighting. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. Other thing, just to like, you probably won't need to do a lot of this with your rigs. I just want you guys to be aware that it don't crash again. Fantastic. The simplest of joint change explodes the industry standard program. Hooray. But you can export weight maps and basically save them for later. So if you ever for some reason need to unbind your skin and you want to reapply it, but you don't want to like redo all the weights, again, you can set up a weight map to do that. And these are based on UVs. So before you do this, you should have your object UV'd. Overlapping UVs are going to affect how your weights transfer in. So at a minimum, sometimes I make like crappy rigs for like crappy 3D printed objects that I'm not texturing, but I just like want the functionality to export the map, and I will literally just automatic map the whole character and leave them like that. Theoretically, your characters should be UV'd by the time you're doing this, so you should have nice UVs. In this case, we just have glorious default cylinder UVs. But if you want to export a weight map, select your skin, go to your rigging menu, skin, and there is an option that is literally just export weight maps. This one I usually do open the settings for because I've not found a huge difference between alpha or luminance for your export value, but I do usually like to make this like slightly larger because 250 pixels is not a lot to work with. And just because I hate ifs, I will usually set this to like a PNG. That way I can actually, do you not have PNGs in it? All right, JPEGs it is, because PNGs doesn't exist. I just like the visual of being able to actually open these in another program and like see what the weights are doing. So I'm just gonna hit apply with the skin connected, and it's going to ask me where I want to stash this map, and of course it's not set my project. It's gonna make a source images folder, and I will call the file weights, because I am creative as a person. I will save that, and you can see, if you can see the bottom of the screen, it's just sort of going through and like adding some little maps to that. Basically, what it should look like, if I can find the actual desktop, is, so when it generates weights, it's going to make this little weight map, and this is what you're going to import back in when you want to reload these weights. And it's also going to make a file, or a folder full of files, and it's going to be basically one file for each joint, and it's going to show the weight values of that, of all of the vertices for that joint. So if I like pull this open, my object, no, all right. Back to the Microsoft Paint option. Where's the open with? Really? There we go. But basically for each joint, it's just going to tack the weights onto that vertice position on your UVs, if that makes sense. So for the default cylinder view, you can see that like one whole top is attached to the shoulder, and then it kind of like tapers off towards the elbow, and you can see like where that sad elbow extrusion I made there was on that little patch of UVs there. So the more joints you have, the more weights are going to be in this folder, or the more files are going to be in this folder. And again, I just like sort of using JPEGs or TIFFs or like something I can view later, because sometimes, every once in a while, something's weird with my weights. Having that visual, I can go back in and either modify them manually or just sort of visually see them and like troubleshoot things. So that's exporting weight maps. Any questions on that? All right. If I want to import a weight map, I'm just going to, again, unbind this. I'll do unbind skin. And then I'm just going to select my skin, select my joint, my skin. I will bind the skin as normal. Huzzah. And if I scrub through, so you can see, like, here's the sort of wonky weights from before. I'm going to select my skin, go into the skin menu, and then just choose the option for import weights right below the one for export weights. And again, you just want to navigate through to wherever you have saved your files and select the weights.weightmap, or whatever your file name is, .weightmap. And it did, don't you dare close. Oh wait, no, this is just the send report thing. Okay. And you can see that like it's not, usually if you have a lot of joints, it'll do a weird thing where it like crushes your mesh down and like stretches it back into place. But if I look, don't crash again. Come on. Oh, this is insane. You can't. All right. I was gonna scrub through and show you that it should have like the new weights that we saved previously, but I think Maya has just decided to not function at all today. Okay. That's upsetting. Super weird. Any questions on it yet so far that I can answer without using Maya? Yes.
What if you were to do, like, for example, something more robotic, and like, between the shoulder and the elbow was one mesh, and from the elbow to the wrist there's a second mesh? Would you do that with one rig?
Yeah, so you can still definitely use that as one rig. I'll actually pull up, you just see if it works real quick. But I'll actually pull up, because like the armor on the other character was like kind of done the same way. But I just use that like the bind individual joints option for that. But yeah, like as long as, and if you have like interlocking parts on the elbow that like look like they should be pivoting correctly, as long as you set up the joint in the direct center of like a ball and socket joint, it's gonna keep its place and like not start clipping through other pieces of your mesh. Any other questions? Cool. All right. I am hellbent on seeing if I can make this work. So I've just unbound and rebound that skin. Wonky bend, select skin, import weight map, find weight map. Hooray! No! Don't you, no, okay. All right, this weight map is clearly cursed. Normally it doesn't crash Maya every time you try to import a weight map. I've literally never seen it before, but I will give up on this. While I restart Maya for like the 5th time, any other questions? All right. I will say that at least Maya does load very quickly on these computers. All right. So that is actually pretty much most of the rigging stuff that I have set up, or have for you guys. Really quick, I'll just like briefly go over like a decent outliner structure for your rig. I'm going to use the one with the IK handle to do this, and hopefully mine won't crash. I have absolutely no faith in this program anymore. It's going to bust into my outliner. So usually when you're doing some kind of rig, I'm just going to also get rid of these. You will have some kind of like large sort of major control. So again, for the flour sack, it was like that big one with arrows on it. I actually usually just don't put the control in at all, and I use a null group for it because I barely ever have to use it. But I'm just going to say this control is called like master control. This one is shoulder, and this one is wrist. So this is like horrible. It's not that bad in the outliner because there's 3 joints, but like get more joints and it gets really gross. So ideally you would want to group these all together. So I'm just going to call this my arm group. And you'll notice that like if I go and I move just this group with all of the stuff in it, the skin starts like ripping out of the skeleton and everything gets like super weird. Basically what this is double transformations. So what's effectively happening is your controllers move your joints and your joints drive your skin. So for the double transformations in this case, what's happening is that you're basically selecting it twice, so it's moving twice. So when I grab this whole arm group, it's grabbing the controllers and the joints, and that's fine. But what it's also grabbing is the skin. So as the joints and controllers move with this group, the skin should move, and then since the skin is selected on its own, it's moving twice the distance or again. Does that make sense? All right. So if you want to avoid that happening, and you should want to avoid that happening, is you need to set up the rig in a certain sort of way. And usually that is, so I'm just going to group the controls together because it's more organized. And then the rig is sort of on its own, and this is skin. And I have notes about this, and I always forget like which order stuff should go, but usually I believe it's grab the controls and the skeleton itself and group those together. And this is going to be your sort of like master group. And this is if you want to move your object in the scene or like scale it, this is what you're going to grab. So theoretically, if I grab that, you can see that I'm able to now move this or scale this or rotate this, and the skin isn't doing anything super weird. I still have the animations on my object, etc. And then for like so again, that's just, in that group, you want your controls and the joints themselves. Zero that out. Everything, so like skin, IK handles, shouldn't go into that group. Also, if I had anything that was attached with constraints, like pieces of mesh like eyeballs or something like that, attached to joints with constraints, that would also go into this master group and not be kept separately. Usually, if I can't figure out where something goes, I just sort of look at it and I'm like, all right, where's the double transformation happening? And then I'll just sort of like shift it around to my outliner until I find somewhere where it's not exploding. But this is like sort of the thing that I've come to that works pretty nicely. So one group for all of your stuff to keep things organized. Again, master group with your controls and your joints, and then just sort of all of your other IK handle and skins and stuff separately is what I found to work pretty nicely for me. Alternately, I just made this like giant control that I was going to be like, oh, I'm going to use this to move my character, and then I am so force of habit not using that I didn't use it. So what I'm going to do is, if I want like to use this controller to move, scale, rotate my object when he's first put in the scene, I'm just going to separate that out of my master group and then grab the controls, put them under the master controller, and grab the joints and also put them under the master controller. So basically this is just functioning as a physical clickable version of that null group, that null master group that I just made, which you can then move around and scale and rotate however you want. They both work exactly the same. My personal preference is to just leave it as a null group, since, again, you will literally only use this to position your object when you first put it in the scene and maybe scale it a bit. I just don't like having the extra controller floating around in the scene that whole extra time. But functionally, again, it really doesn't matter which one you do. But that is more or less the outliner setup that I usually use for rigging. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right. Just double check things really quick. All right. Smarter, not harder. Cool. Great. Okay. And then just weird hotkeys that I happen to have noted down here. In case you you weren't aware, Alt and B as in boy will toggle through the background colors that are default with Maya. And then if you're ever looking for a quick way to delete history on an object, Alt-Shift-D is the hotkey for that. Also, fun tidbit about rigging in particular, if you select a skin and you say like you like that pose, you can duplicate that object, and you'll notice that it's actually, because it was duplicated from a bound object, it's gone and locked all of the translate, rotate, scale values. So I'm just going to click on them and do unlock selected, and then I can then actually move this. But it's going to hold that position no matter what the rig is doing. So if you're ever just like looking to make some quick poses for things, or like, I'm picturing, you know, if you're making minis for 3D printing, you could sort of do multiple poses of the same guy and iterate really, really quickly with that. You can also, if you're so inclined, grab the skin itself and delete history on it. So could also do Alt-Shift-D. And that will basically decouple it from the joints and hold it in that position as well. Downside of this is now it's permanently detached from my skeleton, and there's no way to get back that original bind pose. So kind of like the duplicating method, just because I have the skeleton easily set up if I want to ever tweak the pose. Just some kind of like weird stuff with rigging, I guess. Any questions on any of that? All right. Any questions on anything we've gone over so far today? Yep.
When I was rigging the other day, I set up something similar to like your master group, but I still was having like the double transformations thing because the joints were moving and then the controls were moving. So
Yeah.
moving the joints, so I put the joints in like a completely separate. How did you have it not move the joints?
So that's the fun thing about rigging is, like, depending on how you set up your rig, your outliner structure might need to be different, which is a colossal pain. So like, I was playing with a rig the other day, and I don't remember exactly what was happening, but I think there were some extra like parent constraints or something in there, and once I like deleted those, it worked fine. If you want to like send me a rig, I can take a look at it, but yeah, rigging is a lot of like really sort of weird just sort of like bumble through and like just try to troubleshoot stuff, and eventually you'll be like, oh my god, like that's what happened, and then you sort of like through that process like remember that for the future as a potential issue, but like usually you'll find out some more ways that like rigs work that I might not think to teach you ordinarily. Yeah.
This is more a question about like best practice. So,
Mhm.
like for example, with the chicken that I made, the only thing that I wanted it to move was its neck. So would I put joints throughout its whole body and just wait only the neck, or would I just put joints?
I mean, it doesn't super matter, to be honest. So I think for animation, it usually doesn't matter at all. If you're doing something for like a game, best practice is to have as little extra stuff as you need. So what I would probably do is just this is gonna be like the ugliest duck that has ever existed. All right. It's gorgeous. Nobody question how amazing this duck looks. This is my duck. So what I, God. So what I would probably do is just put like maybe one joint just sort of in the body. Which way am I even looking at this? All right. So I'm just gonna throw in like one joint here, and then I might have some more joints going up into the neck and then like coming out the head, which I put on the wrong side of the body. So basically this is just sort of like a placeholder that'll have the weights for all of this part of the body on it, and then this is like the next stuff that you actually care about.
That's what I did. I just wasn't sure if that was like the best practice thing.
Nah, it's fine. And then you could also, if you decided you needed more joints in there later, what you could do is go in and just like tack in more joints. If your file is referenced into whatever you're animating on, all those joints and stuff and the new controllers you have to add would also transfer into your animation. So, I mean, I would say honestly, like best practice is just like reference in your rigs, because it allows you to do kind of whatever you need to. Cool. Any other questions? Yep.
How do you hide stuff?
Like just from the outliner?
I don't know, however you do it normally.
Can you talk about the layers?
Hmm?
The layers that you did?
Like,
Okay.
You just will hide stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm a hotkey maniac. If I ever like do things that you don't see me click on a button or you don't know what I did, just please ask me. I do. It's like so force of habit. So yeah. So you have display layers over here, which is if you just want to do like big groups of stuff at once. Like if I wanted to hide all the controllers on my object, you can make those layers here, set those to be referenced, etc. Usually for like individual objects, there's a few things I'll do. So Control H will hide it. And it'll gray it out in the outliner so you just like don't see it. The only way to select it then is to go into your outliner and then show it by doing Shift H. So Control H to hide and Shift H to reshow. And then you can also do a thing which is called Isolate Select. The hotkey for that is Control 1. Or you can just do Show, Isolate, Select, View Selected, but that's like 3 mouse moves, and I hate moving my mouse. But what that does is it's going to display only what you have selected on the screen at a given time. So in this case, I was like built a cube and the rest of this, and I'm like, I don't want to look at all of that, so just like isolate, select, least number of mouse clicks to do that. That also works with like individual faces on things. So if I just like select some faces and do Control 1 to isolate, select, that's only those faces are going to be shown. And I just hit F to zoom in on them on my keyboard. I think those are all hotkeys. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. So apart from, I'll probably go over like a little bit more sort of like advanced rigging and like how to set up something that's like more functional than just this like goofy little arm next week. But that's basic rigging. And you just want to think about while you're designing your rig, like how do you want to move this thing? You know, like do you need like a bendy neck and a stiff body? Do you need like a little wiggly tail on your duck? How are you expecting that to bend? And then just sort of design your rig around that. And again, I'll go over sort of like more of the designing of the rig around specifications next week. But a lot of it is just sort of like how many joints do if I want this neck to be like super, super bendy, it's gonna need more joints than just like bending in one spot. Something like a swan with a huge neck is gonna need more joints than like a human neck. Usually I put like a single joint in my human necks, but anyway. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you guys. So if there are no other questions, feel free to run away. Have a lovely week.